Get started. Welcome to the next in the series of the Governing Intimacies webinars. And today, the topic that we're going to be discussing, or that our panelists are going to be discussing, is looking at right-wing gender politics in the Global South. And I'm very excited to listen to each of the panelists speak. We have Hayley McEwen from Wits University. She's a researcher at the Wits Center for Diversity Studies. We have Samreen Mushtaq, who is currently a research fellow at the Center for Studies in Gender and Sexuality at Ashoka University in India. And we have Sonia Correa, who is an activist and academic, and who coordinates the Sexuality Policy Watch, which is based at the Brazilian Interdisciplinary AIDS Association in Brazil. So very different but similar corners of the Global South. And unfortunately, an increasingly relevant topic, something that's very important to discuss. The format of today's discussion is that each of the panelists will be given an opportunity to talk or present what they wish to discuss. So we're going to start with Hayley, then we'll move on to Samreen, then we'll go to Sonia, and then the panelists will also have an opportunity to discuss and ask questions with each other. And we will, at the end, open up to questions from everybody who's watching. And as I said at the start, if you'd like to submit a question for the panelists, please use the Q&A box at the bottom, because that saves the questions. Otherwise, you're also welcome to use the chat function on the side. And I will share a link to the Facebook live broadcast of this too in the chat panel on the side in a moment. So good afternoon to Hayley and Samreen, and good morning to Sonia. And it's really lovely to have the opportunity to listen to all of you. I've always enjoyed these sessions so much and learned so much from my academic practice and just also personal insight. We're going to start with Hayley, so I'm going to hand over to you and listen.
Great. Well, thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you to all the organizers for inviting me to speak on this esteemed panel. So I think before I get into my topic, which will be talking about the so-called pro-family movement in South Africa, I just want to quickly take a moment to position myself in relation to this research, because some people might be wondering why there's an American talking about pro-family activism in South Africa. So in a nutshell, I am from the United States. I grew up as part of a queer family. And, you know, growing up in a queer family, in a society where, you know, there is one kind of family that is idealized, which is the nuclear family. You know, as I grew older, I was able to, you know, see that the kind of family that I was in was very much kind of being erased within the kind of US Christian right narratives, and also delegitimized. And also as a young woman growing up there and seeing how the US Christian right is constantly trying to erode reproductive rights, you know, it's given me a lot of insight into this so-called pro-family movement. And then I moved to South Africa in 2005, and it was in 2008 that same-sex marriage was legalized here. And it was around that same time that I started to hear these hauntingly familiar echoes of, you know, US Christian right discourses here in South Africa. So this kind of set me off on a journey of doing research, investigating the kinds of links between these discourses, and a lot of my work, you know, it's based on previous scholars who have done previous research, talking about the U.S. Christian right's foreign policy, and how the U.S. Christian right has been trying to globalize this narrative of family values since the 1990s. So that's just a bit of context. I do have a couple of slides. I find it helps me get through more information in a quicker amount of time. And also just to give you some examples of what we're seeing here in South Africa when it comes to the pro-family movement. And also just to say, you know, this movement, they call themselves pro-family, which is a very familiar rhetorical trick of this, the US Christian right, of course, calling themselves pro-life, for example, and casting anyone who's critical of them as anti-life or anti-family. And yeah, so just a couple of examples of what we've been seeing here in the South African context. One thing that really got quite hot in 2019 was the Stop Comprehensive Sexuality Education campaign. You can see on the left there was a march. There was also, that was organized by the African Christian Democratic Party, as well as some other pro-family organizations here in South Africa. They also had this campaign, part of this campaign was putting up these billboards that said things like, teach our kids maths, not masturbation. This was a photograph taken off of the highway here in Johannesburg. More recently, that was 2019. More recently, again, the African Christian Democratic Party, but also Family Policy Institute, Freedom of Religion South Africa, and some other organizations have been, fighting against this draft legislation that's seeking to, create gender and sexuality inclusivity in schools. And on the bottom right there, that's a reference to this draft legislation. And it's, one of the first times I've actually seen this phrase gender ideology used here in South Africa. Although this is a phrase that I'm sure as we'll be hearing later, we hear in many parts of the world when people are opposing, LGBTI rights, gender studies, so on and so forth. So some of the organizations here in Eastern and Southern Africa that we could call pro-family and which call themselves pro-family and which are part of this, really globally coordinated movement against LGBTIQ rights is, here's some examples. So there's Family Policy Institute, which is here in South Africa. It has direct links with US Christian right organizations. Cause for Justice. There's this one, Leave Our Kids Alone, which is interesting because there's very similar campaigns like Don't Mess With Our Kids that we see in other parts of the world that are against comprehensive sexuality education specifically. There's also Citizen Go. There's now actually an office in Nairobi, a Citizen Go office in Nairobi, although it's actually based in Spain, the headquarters. And then this East African Center for Law and Justice, which is an African branch of the American Center for Law and Justice, which is headed and started by former President Trump's former lawyer, Jay Sekulow. And it was founded by Pat Robertson. So some of the arguments, just to give you a quick overview, that these pro-family organizations make, against a whole range of issues related to gender and sexuality diversity are, that it's un-African, it's a form of cultural imperialism, it's a form of population control in disguise, it's an attack on the traditional family, religious values, it's bad for the economy, nation, society, it's an attack on parental rights, it's dangerous for children and families, and it's a product of Western elites and liberals and a Trojan horse of liberal Western values. Sorry, we've got a plane flying over here. It's very loud. So, of course, these organizations, gosh, I feel like I live in a war zone. This helicopter solo. So in terms of these organizations, right, who are promoting these arguments, we know they are not acting alone, okay? They have been in many ways financially and in other ways supported by US Christian right organizations. So I've got a sample at the top. I've also just got Citizen Go in there, even though that is Spanish. But there are multiple centers of power as well with the pro-family movement. So there was a really interesting report that came out by Open Democracy last year, where they found that, I think it's over the past 8 years, that 28 US Christian right organizations have spent more than $280 million globally to influence sexual politics, okay, abroad. And a huge chunk of this money has been spent in African countries. So what are some of the things that this money is being spent on, right? This is a lot of money. So we can obviously see that pro-family activities like we're seeing in South Africa, it's really not a backlash. It's not like isolated groups that are kind of getting upset about CSE. Like these organizations and this kind of campaigning is very much organized and coordinated and well funded. So they've been investing in strategic marketing and communications. They develop international networks and coalitions. They also mentor, pro-family organizations and conservative activists around the world, and they will bring these individuals over to the United States to mentor them to become, pro-family delegates in their own contexts and also at the United Nations. And their open democracies also shown evidence of that. They do a whole lot of different kinds of campaigning, and they have events online and offline. They have, they're investing money in growing the next generation of activists, pro-family activists. They're monitoring and intervening in all kinds of advocacy related to advancing sexuality and gender-related rights. They also have strategic litigation organizations, and they're also producing knowledge in their own, ultra-conservative think tanks to try and discredit, gender studies, comprehensive sexuality education, and so on and so forth. So, in terms of the work that I've done around this this pro-family movement and its interest in African countries, I've really wanted to understand why. So, I mean, in growing up in the US, in that context, as I mentioned, I was able to see, okay, this is like a patriarchal movement, without a doubt, But when I came here and then looked at the movement from here, it suddenly became really obvious that it is such a colonial movement, right? And all of these organizations promoting pro-family agendas abroad have links or are themselves deeply ethno-nationalist in the context of the United States. So it's a huge question to be asked, why are they even bothering going abroad, right, to spread this agenda? They're so ethno-nationalist. And I think we can start to think about that more when we trace and unpack the kinds of ideologies that they are advancing. So mainly this idea of the gender binary and the gender hierarchy, which is institutionalized in the nuclear family model. These are colonial constructions. These were mechanisms of colonial conquest and ways of destroying indigenous knowledge systems of gender and sexuality during colonialism. So these groups now, if you look at their narratives, they're very much reproducing and reinforcing colonial Eurocentric constructions of gender, sexuality, and family. And they're also universalizing this idea of the nuclear family, which is a colonial epistemological kind of orientation, right? Is this universalizing effect, right? An effort to erase, right, alternative ways of knowing and doing gender and sexuality that have always existed on the continent and other places in the world, and which continue to exist, right? And they also, have really capitalized on, this decolonial discourses and imperatives by, positioning the kind of pro-family agenda as a decolonial agenda, right? By saying, we are from the United States and look at what these crazy, liberals have done in our context. And we're here now to help you and warn you, so that they don't mess up your society too, okay? And also, of course, the pronatalism of the movement and its ideology also is another, point that they use to build connections with and construct themselves as legitimate allies of, African audiences who they address and want to pull into their, their movement. So this term epistemicide, I think, is really helpful to name what it is that they are doing and to understand what they're doing. It's a term that Boaventura de Sousa Santos uses, as well as other decolonial scholars. And really, this idea is based on the notion that, when the colonial tactic of destroying knowledge systems in order to destroy people. And the way that, De Sousa Santos writes about it is that the destruction of indigenous knowledge systems and spiritual systems and social systems was as important to the project of colonization as, slavery and the theft of land. All right. So when we look at what the pro-family movement is doing, and we look specifically at some of their campaigns and discourses, we can see that they are trying to erase and delegitimize forms of gender, sexuality, and kinship diversity. They're erasing gender identities and expressions beyond the male-female binary, because again, the gender binary is very central to their ideology, and upholding the gender binary as, biological, fixed, and essential. And they're trying to delegitimize and erase families that do not conform to heteronormativity and heteropatriarchy, as well as delegitimizing forms of knowledge that, engage with and open up alternative ways of knowing and doing gender and sexuality diversity. So when we look and add all of this up, and look at this as like the ideological project, we can see also the very violent, genocidal implications of this erasure, right? Because ultimately this kind of argumentation, it delegitimizes, demands for rights. It says that, queer people and gender nonconforming and transgender people have no legitimate right to exist, right? Which of course, it sanctions violence against these communities. And we have seen spikes in murder and in hate crime against transgender people in many parts of the world in recent years, right? And at a deep level, a deeper level, they are really trying to discredit the entire paradigm and ethos of social justice, equality, and human rights by saying that just like some people, queer people, do not have like a legitimate claim to equal rights. So if you can make that argument against one vulnerable, marginalized group, you can reproduce that, right, in relation to other vulnerable groups. And just to say and conclude, all of this is happening against a backdrop of violence against queer people. These are just people who have, on the slide, these are people who have been killed in the past few months in South Africa. And, obviously, we can't say that like there's pro-family activists like committing these crimes. I mean, I'm not in any way suggesting that. But what I am suggesting is that the kind of ethos they are creating, the anti-rights ethos that actively tries to erase queer people and deny, queer people a right to exist, that is certainly contributing to this current that we are seeing of hostility, hate, and intolerance against queer people. So thank you so much. I will conclude there, and I hope I did not go too much over time. Thank you.
Thanks very much for the presentation, Haley, and also so many important issues and so many intersections with other topics. I mean, when I was looking at what you're saying about the ACDP, the African Christian Democratic Party's involvement in messaging, this pro-family messaging, I was also thinking it's the same organization in South Africa that's been engaging in anti-vaccine messaging. And there's so many similarities between the type of messaging used against vaccines or vaccine hesitation and pro-family. So a lot to discuss there. We're going to move on to our next speaker, Samreen Mushtaq, and going to let you talk, so I'm not going to do more of a preamble. Please go ahead, Samreen.
Thank you so much. And thank you to everyone at Governing Intimacies for organizing this really important webinar series. Uh, what I'll be doing today is primarily speaking about India's secular colonial project as it is underway in Kashmir and its very gendered framings. Um, I would especially want to talk about the kinds of continuities that India's colonial engagement with Kashmir throws up, as opposed to, there's this popular perception that it has quite significantly somehow altered only due to a right wing government in India. Um, so on August 5th, 2019, India's right-wing Modi government announced the reading down of Article 370 of the Indian Constitution, which, even if its provisions had been hollowed out over the years, was still seen to accord this kind of a special status to Jammu and Kashmir, such that only the permanent residents of the region, could buy land, property, or claim jobs in the region. Uh, Now, with this gone, there obviously were anticipations of demographic change that would manipulate the nature of the Kashmir issue. And expectedly, the mainstream Indian media centered voices that actually strongly supported the move along the lines of, as it has always done, India's national security and integrity of the nation. Now, while I do not have the time here to, get into a detailed explanation of Article 370 and what was eventually done after August 2019, or how this is being seen as, in many ways, the strengthening of India's settler colonial project in Kashmir. But something that I want to bring up is, how this was justified uh, by invoking gender equality. So it was argued that this article had, over the years, prevented women of Jammu and Kashmir who married non-residents from holding property in the state. And so the right wing argument was that in an era heralding gender equality, this absolutely regressive article, in comparison to the progressive views of the right wing, had to go. Uh, so the Indian state, what it did was it was showing itself as this savior of oppressed Kashmiri women, who, needed to be empowered by these policies, by these decisions of the Indian state. This savior narrative has often been employed, especially with a lot of Islamophobic tropes, to build this narrative around not just Kashmiri women, but the Indian state itself, where both Kashmiri women and the Indian state need saving from this dreaded, dangerous, radicalized Kashmiri Muslim man who is always this enemy other. But it is notable that in 2002, a ruling by the state's highest court of law actually stated that Kashmiri women, even when they married non-residents, could own property in the state. And at the time of the abrogation of Article 370, it was this court ruling that actually remained valid. But if you looked at media narratives during this time, this ruling was never really brought up. And instead, it was argued that, women were always disempowered because of Article 370. And so the state had to, abrogate this article. Another interesting justification that was given was that, you know uh, removing this was this uh, giant leap for Kashmir's LGBTQ community. It was a progressive step towards gay liberation. Again, this was a narrative that activists challenged, because the legal provisions that were available around these rights that applied to Indian states were also applicable to Jammu and Kashmir, even before this August 2019 decision. So this was therefore seen to be this clear case of pink washing, where, uh, the state was trying to weaponize this language, this discourse around LGBTQ rights, to basically cover up for its brutal human rights record and militarization in and over Kashmir. Uh, there were also several misogynistic remarks that, were made by BJP leaders during this time, that now that the article was gone, so Indian men would now be able to marry fair-skinned Kashmiri women. Uh, these discursive practices basically allow for thinking how this control over Kashmir is seen quite synonymous with control over Kashmiri women's bodies, who are often presented as, beautiful, exotic, much like how you would see in the Indian discourse, even Kashmir being presented as this feminized, exoticized territory, this beautiful heaven on earth that, uh, the Indian state owns and, needs to keep integral to itself. Now, this discourse of, uh, you know, uh, controlling Kashmiri bodies, especially women in this sense, is an ongoing militaristic tactic which renders women increasingly vulnerable in the times of a conflict. Uh, One of the examples that I would like to talk about here is this case of the Kunanposhpur mass rape in 1991, where at least 30 Kashmiri women were subjected to gang rape in their homes by soldiers of the Indian Army. Uh, Supreme Court of India put a stay on the proceedings in the case a couple of years ago. Uh, so there's this vulnerability of being subjected to sexual violence, which also then impacts, women's everyday movement, since the streets are also heavily militarized. And this is a place that is known as the highest militarized zones in the world because of the presence of 700,000 Indian soldiers. Uh, this militarized control from the streets also enters into homes, where this distinction between homes being this apparently safe space and there being this outside, which is the actual battleground where the war actually takes place out there, this distinction is erased essentially. And this is especially seen through cordon and search operations, which are this part of the Indian forces counterinsurgency tactic, where you see the armed forces, they close off a locality, they barge into homes. This happens like at any time, mostly around midnight. These operations are pretty common in search of militants or weapons. Now, these operations often involve damage to the property, harassment and torture of family members, and arrest of suspects in a lot of cases. But about these operations, while they have continued, they have existed since the 90s when the armed insurgency with popular support erupted in Kashmir. Uh, they were intensified during the COVID pandemic. And it's really interesting, the COVID induced lockdown was used to push this state of exception as a normal governing paradigm in Kashmir. So previously, you would have, uh, justifications for suspending Kashmiri's fundamental rights through the notion of law and order. Now, with the COVID pandemic, you had these tropes of public safety, healthcare, medicine, care. So all of these tropes were used to, normalize these violent practices. Uh, but as one speaks of the gendered practices of military occupation, uh, it is important to not only speak of women's experiences in this context, but also to acknowledge how there's a certain organization, a certain pattern of gender, that the military occupation relies on. Uh, so while you have some Kashmiri women who are arrested at the moment, or you have a pro-freedom women's organization that stands banned, uh, but largely the pattern is that it's like the violence against men is more of a public action, uh, more visible, while that against women is kind of invisibilized and hidden from the public view. Uh, Kashmiri men's bodies are subjected to this erasure of sorts, uh, through various practices. So you have killings, then there's the practice of enforced disappearances, uh, Also, the pandemic protocol has been used to refuse families refuse to return the bodies of those killed by Indian forces. Uh, then you have these coordinate search operations during which men are mostly picked. Uh, then you have public torture. So all of this, what it does is it in a way renders men absent from their homes, and therefore uh, makes homes into these sites that are then primarily occupied by women. Uh, and then these are the homes that become the battleground away from the public view, as I said, where violations are committed against women during these coordinate search operations. Uh, the very occurrence of these operations subjects women to this powerfully effective future of a violence, which is built on this anticipatory insecurity. So, uh, knowing how this violence has existed and occurred and continued since the 90s makes it almost certain that, you know, such an operation would occur, that such an operation comes with, you know, sexual violence against women. uh, but what is uncertain is exactly when this operation would occur. So there's always that fear of a certain uncertain violence happening. uh, this control over the last years has also extended as a form of digital militarism now, where it enables a form of surveillance of the digital space. So, in fact, as recently as last week, the police in Jammu and Kashmir warned Kashmiris regarding social media posts in solidarity with Palestine. Uh, that's the, you know, kind of surveillance of these spaces. But also then it's interesting how these spaces emerged as alternate sites of war, because um, you also see people using various ways to subvert this state dominance and surveillance. So one example that I, amongst many that I would like to talk about here, is this anonymous collective of Kashmiri women called Zanan Wanan, which is the Kashmiri for Women Speak. So they came out with the Kashmiri adaptation of the Italian anti-fascist song Bella Ciao. Uh, and in this song, they traverse this long history of oppression and occupation in Kashmir, locating these varied markings on Kashmir's wounded collective body, you know, from bullets to pellet shotguns to tear gas shells to the chronicling of the August 5, 2019 siege, when the entire region was put under a communications blackout and curfew for months altogether. Uh, and it is, you know, as a challenge to the snatching away of Kashmiri women's agency and erasure of their lived experiences, as a challenge to states' narratives of empowering Kashmiri women, as a challenge to the Indian state presenting itself as this, you know, savior of Kashmiri women, that these oral narratives from women themselves, as they appear in this case, for example, in the digital space, they reject this favor of being placed at margins, you know. Uh, and in a lot of ways, you know, this space also becomes this site to speak to each other's struggles and envision transnational solidarity. Um, as a last point, something that I really would want to bring up again is that while we speak of violence and resistance in Kashmir against Indian states' militarization and military occupation, and now this strengthening settler colonial project, it is also important to note that in sustaining this occupation, there has not essentially been a rupture between previous regimes and the right wing Modi government. Uh, so, in that sense, August 2019 was no breakdown, because for a people who witnessed killings, torture, enforced disappearances, mass graves, rapes, mass blinding, house demolitions for decades now, this was something that was more of continuity in that violence and dispossession. Perhaps what has changed is that the ways have become more brutal, you know, more out there in the open. Uh, a large part of that is because that is where the right wing support for the BJP comes from, you know, in suppressing people opposed to its rule and to teach a lesson to the disloyal Kashmiri Muslims. Uh, but what the BJP is now able to do is largely built on what the previous regimes did, with absolute impunity to Indian soldiers for the violations in Kashmir, which have always been justified in the name of national interest. Uh, so, in that sense, that line between, say, what India's right wing is now doing in Kashmir and what its previous governments have done is pretty much a blurred one. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Samreen. And without getting into, we're already starting to get some comments and questions, which we'll get to towards the end of the talk. We're going to move to Sonia now. But I think what is also noticeable about this, and as somebody who studies the history of violence, is to note again that, as you point out, Samreen, all of these aspects were there before, but they're becoming bolder. Sometimes they're becoming more violent. We're seeing them expressed with more impunity. And that is obviously something that's incredibly concerning. We're going to move over to our last speaker, Sonia Correa, and then we're going to move into sort of a discussion between the panelists. Sonia, over to you.
Yeah. Well, good afternoon. Good morning. Is there anybody from my region or this side of the world watching us? I really want to thank a lot Sirla and Kayo and the team that is organizing the webinars, because for us who have been working on these topics for the last 5 years through regional lenses, it's really important to be able to engage with researchers and activists and perspectives that are coming from other regions. So I think this is an incredibly privileged opportunity of exchange. What I'm bringing to you is grounded in the research that Sexuality Policy Watch has conducted between 2018 and 2019 in Latin America, when we performed 8 case studies on anti-gender politics that has been sweeping across the region since 2013, a time frame that coincides with concurrent flares of anti-gender mobilizations in Europe. And because of that, we have developed the research in close dialogue with our European partners, but also keeping an eye on similar dynamics of what was at play in the US, because as Haley said, we cannot speak of anti-gender politics without looking at a very important source of those discourses and political dynamics. The studies have covered Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Colombia, Costa Rica, Ecuador, Paraguay, Mexico, and Uruguay, but also the dynamics at play at the Organization of the American States, where these forces have been acting since the same period, and a genealogical essay on the religious formations that are at the core of these crusades. Outcomes in English are available today in the form of short videos and a summary of the case studies that we have published in January 2001. And we are now updating the studies, in particular to look at how anti-gender actors and forces have behaved during the COVID context, exactly to show what Michama was saying, that they shifted or they combine anti-gender politics with anti-vaccine, denialism, supporting Bolsonaro and other leaders of the same profile. What I'm going to bring to you in this very short intervention are not so much the empirical findings, much more analytical insights that delineate the elements of this anti-gender politics that are singular to Latin America, but may also offer general contours that eventually could be applied to similar cyclones that are happening elsewhere. And so I thank Haley for providing so much empirical data, because many of the forces she has described are the same that we are coping with at regional level. I think that one first aspect to be underlined, has also been underlined by Haley, is that national anti-gender formations and dynamics that we have examined, they are very grounded in society, but they're also plugged into a complex web of transnational connections. Many of the actors that Haley mentioned are also part of our constellation of transnational connections. But these connections, I should say, do not fully determine the national dynamics. The context always matters. Quite evidently, for example, what we are witnessing today across the region cannot be detached from deep specters of coloniality, such as the imbrication between colonial mercantilism and Catholicism that was what propelled the conquest of South and Central America in the 16th century, and the deep and entrenched legacies of Catholic religious colonization, which makes the application of epistemicide, while very useful, also very complex in the Latin American context. Secondly, we have to take into account the vast colonial, the weight of colonial human predation and slavery, and its effect on the region's political and economic history, including because it has left behind a very complex intersectional pattern linking race, sexuality, and gender, now inscribed in the myths and realities of mestiçage or the mixed race. Not less relevantly, differently from other colonized territories, Latin American independent nation states were established in the 19th century, which implies that we also have to cope with 200 years of vernacular post-colonial gender and sexuality statecraft. Yet more significantly, to analyze and understand how the eruption of discourses and political mobilizings against gender or gender ideology has taken root in societies, these undercurrents must be situated at the intersection of four structural trends that have defined the regional, political, economic, social, and cultural landscape in the course of the last 4 decades. And these 4 trends are as follows. The first big one is re-democratization, or democratic transitions or expansions that occurred in almost all countries of the region, and certainly in the 9 countries that we have studied since the 1980s. In scanning democratization, it's necessary to look at its virtues, such, for example, as the horizon it has opened for gender and sexuality, the possibility of gender and sexuality democracies. But we also have to take into account, for example, the leftward shift of the year 2000s in the region, when we had a large number of countries that were governed by the left. But most principally, we have to look and tackle the fissure in which anti-genderism has taken root, contributing to propel a drastic rightward shift that immediately followed the 2000 so-called pink era in Latin America. To do so, it is crucial to charter democratic deficits, gaps, and distortions. Though I could say much more about that, here I want to underline 3 dimensions of those deficits. Entrenched social and institutional authoritarianism, as expressed in classism, racism, sexism, homophobia, and transphobia, that democracy has not deeply transformed. The second is long-rooted traces of populism that in Latin America manifest across the political spectrum. We have had historically both left-wing and right-wing and middle ground populism. In that respect, I want to underline that regardless of the transnational buzzword around populism, right-wing populism today, we have to remind that Latin America is the original cradle of post-1940 populism, whose linkage with pre-war fascism is not exactly a secret. So that connection has to be kept in mind. A fourth problem is the unresolved problem of political corruption, because at least in various countries, but particularly Brazil, it has quite easily interwoven with moral corruption, and moral corruption is connected with gender ideology or sexual morality. A second trend to be looked at, macro trend, is the concomitant politicization of the religious that has occurred across all religious traditions from the 1970s onward. This is a huge topic. In Latin America, it has meant a coincidence between the nefarious impacts of the Catholic conservative restoration under Wojtyla, John Paul II, and Ratzinger, that has taken place at the same time as a rapid post-1980 expansion of multiple strands of both foreign and vernacular fundamentalist evangelists. This is very important for Latin America. We are not just like Africa, just being colonized by US evangelism. We have our own evangelical churches that in fact are spreading around the world, in particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. Then we have the omnipresence of neoliberal rationality and its political reflections. A Latin American singularity in that regard is that as early as 1970, Chile under Pinochet was a testing ground for neoliberal policies, even before Thatcher and Reagan. And these policies were implemented in close association with extreme forms of ultra-Catholic morality. Since then, across the region, the naturalization of neoliberalism has led to higher levels of inequality and precariousness, but also, and this is more relevant following Wendy Brown's analysis, it had wide de-democratizing effects. We can maybe discuss that in the debate. The states have been reduced to managerial functions, the minimalization of rights, just vote and property, the depolitization of the social, but also the spread of the ingrained essentialist tenets of neoliberal thinking in what concerns gender and the family. Finally, in many countries, a fourth tendency to be accounted for is structural violence, political and agrarian conflicts, and mostly drug trafficking and the war on drugs that have been fitting conditions and sentiments of stark abnormality and fear. In Brazil, for example, these conditions cannot be effaced when we are examined the ways in which, during the 2018 electoral process, the straw man of gender ideology as a threat to the natural gender order has productively clasped with underlying popular sentiments of disorder, that conjunction of different types of disorders. Moving towards the features and effects of the cyclones, I want to begin by quoting our partner, Fernando Serrano, who, examining the nefarious effects of anti-gender politics in the 2016 Colombian peace agreement, has written that anti-gender politics is not a single phenomenon, a solid organic something, but comprises an accumulation of events which have different trajectories, generate resonances and connections, but it's not the same everywhere. Inspired by his insights, I have crafted the image of a hydra or multiple hydras to grasp and interpret these undercurrents that were emerging for our case studies. I think that the metaphor is productive in many ways. Hydras are very ancient and resilient creatures, and this compels us not to lose sight of their longevity, even when they may look very new when we are looking at that. Secondly, their fluid shapes and numerous heads moving around depict quite well the shifting and rather obfuscating contours of the assemblage we have been coping with. Because, albeit gestated in a Catholic cradle, gender ideology is a Vatican invention or ultra-Catholic invention, they now comprise a variety of eventually conflictive political forces and are fueled by what seems to be very incoherent ideological streams. Across Latin America, anti-gender hydras have at its core a neoconservative religious hub comprised by evangelical fundamentalists and ultra-Catholics. And around this hub, we have a complicated gamut of other political actors which resonates the picture that Haley has brought to us. We have politicians, liberal professionals, neoliberal think tanks, and political activists, right-wing libertarians, mothers defending homeschooling, open fascist formations, and in some places like Brazil and Uruguay, military voices speaking the language of anti-gender ideology. And in Brazil, we have even the Jewish right in that ecology. In terms of ideological streams, these formations encompass all doctrines of the Spanish and Brazilian ultra-Catholic institutions, originalist rights ideas crafted by US neoconservative evangelicals, ultra-neoliberal economic arguments, and various North American and European streams of anti-Marxism. And this is not a minor aspect of the Hydra. Since last year, unfortunately, this ecology also counts with the expanding presence of anti-gender and anti-transgender feminist streams that were forged in an entirely different epistemological trajectory. Our findings also confirm the usefulness of the conceptual frame crafted by Eastern European feminists that have scrutinized these formations in the region. Gender ideology is an open syntagma that operates as a glue, collating floating signifiers and heterogeneous publics. It's like an open basket into it and from which different issues like gender and sexuality and education, gender itself, same-sex marriage, gender violence laws, gender identity laws, and trans rights are put in or taken out to mobilize moral panics or to be shot, to be in a mire, because they talk about the different or the demonized political subjects that are depicted as abject. Beyond its multiple targets of accusations and hatred, the feminists, LGBT persons, trans bodies, women who abort, anti-gender ideology pertain to and have fueled wider cyclones that in fact aim at the control of the political order itself. In that respect, I think that the more significant contribution of regional and international feminist and queer investigations and conceptualization of anti-gender politics is to show how gender and sexuality and reproduction are at the eye of these political hurricanes that are shifting politics in many places around the world towards the right. This is so because these are strategic domains where anti-gender and rightward politics has gained muscles in preparation for grabbing state power, but they also are pivot realms upon which the hierarchical, undemocratic, authoritarian, asymmetric, racist, exclusionary politics or political projects these forces carry are to be settled. This means that also, as observed by Serrano, anti-gender politics is politics through other means. I think this is very important because by and large, the analysis of anti-gender politics has looked into specific subjects. And I think it's important to emphasize the objective of taking hold of the political order, because this implies that the lenses that we have been using to read the phenomenon must be expanded to identify other heads of the hydra and its effects. For example, in the case of Latin America, gender has been systematically assaulted in association with the stark accusations against Marxism, cultural Marxism, communism, and globalism. This is not exactly new, but neither our research nor other studies of the hydras have given the necessary attention to this dimension. And I think we have to, it's quite urgent to begin looking at anti-gender politics in connection to this very old stream of anti-Marxist thinking, exactly because this connects with the structural political order. If nothing else, and I'm going to end here,
Great.
because this attack has at its core a blatant repudiation of egalitarianism, notions of equality, without which it's not possible to claim for gender and sexuality, democracy, justice, liberty, and freedom. Thank you. Sorry for the time, Chava.
No, thank you very much, Sonia. It's such a detailed topic, and I'm busy taking notes, listening to everybody. I was wondering if, before we just take some of the questions that we have, if I could also just ask Haley and Samreen back, because one of the things that's so interesting, and one of the points that you make, is also the response in the global South by the right wing, in some contexts as a pushback to democracy. So this we've seen in North America, but also in Latin America, where, as you said, there was kind of this, in the 2000s, there was kind of growing sense of kind of left policies and politics. And there's often a sense that the right wing response is a pushback to that. However, we couldn't really say there's a pushback in Kashmir, because was there the same level of that? So I'd be interested for Haley and Samreen maybe just to weigh in on the idea of how, is it because of a shift to the left, or is it because there was no shift to the left? Either of you can start, Samreen or Haley.
I have a view on that, but I'll let others speak.
If we could get Haley or Samreen to talk, that would be great.
I'll just jump in there quickly. I was hoping Samreen would come in because you had asked about Kashmir, but I will go. I'll just say something quickly, which is, I think, yeah, it is obviously, it is a pushback, because there is recognition that, the struggle for increasing, recognition of gender and sexuality diversity, reproductive rights, they have made such serious advances in many contexts, especially in the UN. And what a lot of people who have been doing research on, the pro-family movement have found, and have written about, is how this movement was in many ways born out of two very important conferences that happened at the United Nations in the 1990s, where, issues around the way gender was being spoken about was opening up, LGBTI rights were being put on the agenda. And it was at that moment that these very powerful and well-resourced US Christian right organizations woke up and realized that they also needed to globalize their ambitions. So yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, but I'll just leave it at that.
Thank you. And Samreen?
In the context of Kashmir, largely there has been a blurring of the lines across left, right, center in Kashmir, largely. So it's not really been that, the kind of sexual violence you've seen in the name of the nation in Kashmir, it's cut across the kinds of regimes that have been in power in India. But something that's interesting about the discourses in India that are sympathetic to Kashmir in a sense, or claim allyship, is either it's thought of in a very narrow reductionist human rights discourse where Kashmiris, wanting or thinking of a national imaginary of their own does not have a place, or where, in a sense that, you would speak of sexual violence against Kashmiri women, but you would also speak on behalf of them. You would also place them as caught between the two sides and not actively making choices and not actively, taking part in a resistance movement against military occupation. So it's always a very, toned down solidarity in that sense. And in terms of the colonial relationship, it has not really changed from left to right, except maybe for not the nature of the violence, maybe the intensity of the violence in that sense.
I think what's interesting, and linking back to what Haley was also saying, is what impact Beijing 1995 did or didn't have in different regions is something that perhaps hasn't been explored yet within this dynamic. I'm going to move on to some of the comments because we've already gone over an hour, and I want to get to some of the comments and questions that are coming through. Keval posted while Samreen was talking about when it comes to Jammu and Kashmir, it's interesting how the Indian government seems to be mirroring the propaganda messaging which has been used by the Israeli state in relation to the increased militarization of Palestinian territories and the justification of military violence, particularly when one considers the messaging on terrorism, LGBTQ rights, and the rights of women. And I was thinking very much along those lines, that pinkwashing of a militarized campaign. Just in the question section, Haley, if I can come back to you, Sipiwe has posted a couple of questions. I'm just going to look at the first one, which is talking about, it's not in the South African context, and Sonia also mentioned that while these are common forces, you have to also, what did it say, the national dynamics also matter. And the question from Sipiwe was looking at the large enclave of so-called traditionalists that are a key part of this pro-family movement. So I don't know if you just want to respond to that quickly, and then we'll come back to some other questions.
Sure. Thank you. And thanks so much for the question, Sipiwe. Yeah, I mean, definitely. And I take your point, I didn't have time, unfortunately, to get into the nuance. I sacrificed nuance for the bigger picture. But, one thing that's, and I completely agree with what you're saying, that, it of course is not just it's not just American conservatives like parachuting in and starting this whole movement, right? Like on their own. They need local buy-in. They want to grow their support base internationally. And at least in Eastern and Southern Africa, it's become very clear that they have a kind of three-step strategy that they use for growing their movement in this context. And the first step of that is really about establishing a strong foundation and building up an infrastructure of local people who will lead this movement in our context. And one thing that I found in some recent research that I'm working on is how these organizations based in the US are extremely good at identifying individuals in other countries who will become champions of their agendas. And often these are people who have had political positions of power and have become disenfranchised or are feeling vulnerable for some reason. And it becomes a way that they can grow their support base by creating these narratives around like LGBTI rights or a form of sexual imperialism and all these very emotive issues. Right. So of course, and as Sonia has said, I mean, it's so complex. It is, it's a very complex movement that is like a shapeshifter, right? And that makes it very difficult at times to understand what is really going on. But fortunately, we do have a lot of research and evidence showing the very real strategies and mechanisms that are being used to grow local support so that the movement actually does have a local face. But as we can see, where the money is coming from, it's coming from other parts of the world. Yeah, thanks.
Thanks, Haley. I'm going to come to Sonia with a question in the moment, but I wanted to ask, just following on from that, Samreen, because this is also where that's the sort of globalized pro-family movements. There's so many similarities between what Sonia was discussing, what Haley was discussing, with regional differences. Where is the money coming from in the context of India and Kashmir in terms of who is promoting the messaging around that? I wonder if you have anything to add to that.
So when Haley spoke of epistemicide, that was relatable in a lot of ways. So in the Indian context, you have the Indian government has a proper, networked, well-funded system of trolls. And, there's this proper narrative warfare that goes on, which is why something which aids the dispossession of Kashmiris was actually properly, brought up as a very pro-gender, a pro-gay liberation step. And you had India's mainstream media actually has been quite complicit in this, settler colonial imposition over Kashmir. Uh, and so it is always, the government with the corporates, for whom there's always this, this need to hold on to Kashmir as a territory that is supposed to be this crown of the nation state, in a sense, a feminized territory that, uh, is also about prestige. And so you have, all this coming together from the media to the corporate to the Indian government itself, having this proper elaborate network in India and across the world, that promotes this kind of messaging over Kashmir, such that the voices from Kashmiris are rarely heard, uh, in this framework.
That's a very, very important point, is that the voices of the people affected are so often not heard. I'm going to go on to Kayo's question for Sonia. Kayo said, I think one issue that connects all speakers is the question of violence against gender and sexual minorities. This issue was very central to Samreen and also mentioned by Haley. I wonder if Sonia could tell us if any of the context their project looked at, if they saw a relationship between the anti-gender movements and various forms of gendered violence. Sonia, this is for you.
Well, as it also happened with anti-gender, quote unquote, feelings and sentiments, or conservative sentiments and perceptions and moralities or principles about gender and sexuality that all across Latin America were there as sort of deep layers of social formations that have been incited by these forces. These forces uses their strategy to incite these inertial conservatives to transform it in political energy. In the same manner, gender-based violence, violence against non-conforming people of non-conforming sexualities, particularly trans bodies, has been there for very long. It's nothing new. Huh? It goes back in the case of Latin America. That's why I insisted so much in the deep layer of religious colonialism, because this is grounded in the history of Catholicism in the region, huh? Where these forms of sexuality were systematically chased, huh? Throughout the colonial times. So that violence is there, patriarchal violence, but in fact, what we have seen in these new waves is that you have some hubs, ideological figures in these formations. One of them is the family, the protection of the family. The other is the notions of the deviant sexualities, polymorph sexualities. And the third is the preservation of masculinities. So toxic masculinities, complementary gender systems where women may have some rights, but yet men have the last word. And in particular, at least in Brazil, but also in other contexts, these cyclones are reactivating toxic masculinities. And this has a direct relation with violence of gender-based or sexuality-based violence. It is very difficult to prove the connection. Huh? For example, trans murders in Brazil have been increasing steadily since 2017. We have the hypothesis that this is related to the political conditions of the country because of the political trends that have been taking place after 2016 and then the arrival of Bolsonaro to power. But it's very difficult to make those connections empirically. Huh? So there's an atmosphere that is favorable to gender and sexuality-based violence because it is in the speech act of authorities, they are demising not so much women, certainly feminist, bad behaving women, but homophobic and transphobic discourses are part of the public sphere at this point. So this certainly feeds violence. I also would like to say a word, if possible, maybe not now, about the right and left question, because I think it's really a very important one.
Do you want to make that point now? Because then there's one more comment that we've got and another question, which we've already gone over time. So I want to make sure that we still get to those. So if you can make that point, and then I'll move on to the last comment and question.
Yeah, I really think that when we started, after our research, we began excavating the deep genealogy of these forces. In the religious streams, Catholic and evangelical, but also the secular religious streams that have been feeding the Hydra in the last few decades. And for me, it's very clear that although on the surface, the anti-gender discourse and mobilizing that has taken place in the last 10 years has attacked the left-wing governments that were in place, accusing these governments of being communist and Marxist and totalitarian, and connecting gender to their policies or gender ideology to their policies. In fact, when we look backwards and go to the long courses, we can see that these forces have never disappeared. They have been there for very long, conservative, rightward, even fascist-like formations that have never entirely disappeared. And they have been preparing for very long to take power back, either in liberal democracies or more specifically in countries where left-wing governments were in power. But this is long-term reaction. These forces, you can see that in the US, but also if you look into Latin America. So I think, and the other piece is that, as Samreen has said for India, unfortunately, the left in Latin America has not been exactly exempt from anti-gender ideology discourses. Rafael Correa, who used to be a leader recognized internationally as the main leader of the Latin American left, was a spokesperson for anti-gender ideology. He was speaking on gender ideology in 2013. So there's a blur there. And in addition to that, it's not so true, except from few countries, that left-wing in power was exactly so committed, so deeply committed, and has propelled gender and sexuality democracy. Most governments were extremely ambivalent and reluctant in relation to those agendas. So the picture is really much more complicated than it may look in the surface, I would say.
Thank you, Sonia. I'm going to go now to a question and a comment that was posted by Andrea, reflecting here on the situation in Brazil. Beyond the idea of pushback, it's interesting to think about the notion put forward by Samreen regarding the weaponization of rights discourses as a means to reproduce authoritarian politics. If we look to the United States as a legitimating force of anti-gender politics, as many speakers have been doing, we can see how the individualizing grammar of liberal rights, freedom, equality, etc., makes it that any dispute on these terms is fated to deepen the perverse ways in which these processes are being legitimated. Hence why it seems here that pinkwashing becomes a model for liberal diversity politics. It would be great to hear from the speakers what other sites of dispute they see being mobilized that do not begin nor end in rights-based agendas. So this will be the last space that we have for comments. So I'm just going to, Sonia, if you want to respond to this, you can, but you have to be short, I'm afraid, because I want to give the other speakers time. So if you want to make one comment, and then we'll go to Haley and Samreen to finish. You're muted, sorry.
I'll be very brief. I totally agree with Andrea. In Latin America and elsewhere, there's now this trend of calling these forces anti-right forces. I have a critique to that because I do not think that they are anti-right per se. They have a very specific conception and notion and politics of rights. What I do think is that the rights, the field of rights, of human rights, is in full dispute and contestation at this point. And at the core of this, as I mentioned before, is the individualistic, one element is the individualist notion of rights. That is being propelled by these forces as well when they speak about freedom as an absolute notion of freedom that does not take into account precariousness, relationality, egalitarian values. So I think you're totally right.
Okay, thank you. Let's go to Haley, and Andrea's question should be up on the side there if you need to look at it again. Haley, and then after you will go to Samreen.
Sure, and thank you. I mean, I think just, I mean, a kind of one point that you're making here that I think is really important also is just how these groups who are making these arguments that are so bigoted are working harder to position their narratives, you know, in this framework of rights. Mm-hmm. And in doing so, you know, they really they present themselves as being more normative and more like socially acceptable. You know, it really is a way of concealing that bigotry. And it also, I think, makes it harder to detect when we see it. And I mean, I've heard many examples of people seeing, for example, these like anti-gender demonstrations, or they'll see advertisements for these pro-family demonstrations, and it all like they're presenting themselves also as progressive, and many times, you know, and people will think that they're going to a march for LGBTI rights, and then lo and behold, they arrive there, and it's like an anti-gender protest. So yeah, I don't know if that necessarily responds exactly to this point, but that is just something I wanted to say. But thank you so much.
It does feel like it's they're saying, well, you can't be intersectional if you didn't bring the bigots along, right? Okay, Samreen, I'm going to hand over to you for our kind of concluding comment, responding to this. What are the other sites of dispute that you see being mobilized that don't begin or end in rights-based agendas?
I think all of these agendas are so, you know, linked to each other that you can't really isolate, you know, them from the larger rights-based agendas that they build themselves in. So I'm especially thinking of the Islamophobia, the Islamophobic tropes that are put to use here in the Indian context, for example. So this notion that, you know, the Muslims are there to sort of challenge Hindu supremacy in a sense. They are there to increase their populations, you know, so as to become the majority in the Indian case, or they are this radicalized fundamentalist, you know, people who are always the enemy to the nation in the Indian context. Now, when it comes to Kashmir, the same tropes are used to sort of always speak of an, you know, expulsion of the Kashmiri Muslim man, while also, you know, wanting to assimilate the Kashmiri Muslim woman who has been, you know, because of tradition, because of religion, who has been sort of disempowered. And so these tropes are all, you know, put to use to strengthen that colonial relationship.
It's quite concerning listening to all of those. We are going to have to finish now because it's 2:22 in South Africa. And some more comments are coming through. So I can see we could continue to have a really great discussion about the branding, about the language being used around it. But again, I think what always resonates when we have these discussions is how similar they are. And that's also of great concern because it's kind of the globalization of this sort of anti-gender language and the appropriation of what was initially language of liberation and democracy and turning it into something that is really its inverse. Which is epistemology, you know, on so many levels, personally and academically, cause for great concern. Thank you so much to each of the panelists for giving us your time and for your input. It's been fantastic. We will post the recording online once it's done. I can see Keval's also posting more there. Always speak in rights-based language. We're talking about free speech, open communication. We're speaking in the interest of the child. So we could probably continue for another hour, but we can't. So I wish all of you a fantastic morning, good afternoon to those of you in different time zones. I don't think we've got anybody in an evening with us, but if we do, good night. And see you all at the next Governing Intimacies webinar. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.